Hello, everyone, and good evening. Thanks for joining us for tonight's guided meditation and Dhamma talk from Bhante Suddhāso here at Empty Cloud Monastery. And welcome so far to Kumu, Aaron, Roy, Kristen, Geeta, Ron, Mike, Jens, and Melinda. Good to see everyone. And hello as well to all others who are just viewing at this time. So now I'll pass things over to Bhante for the meditation.
So go ahead and get in meditation posture. Bringing your body into an upright position. Taking a few long, slow, deep breaths. With each breath, letting the body and mind relax. Just letting the body and mind be still. Letting the body be completely motionless. And letting the mind be motionless as well. So not intentionally moving the body in any way, and not intentionally moving the mind in any way. And paying complete, sharp, clear attention to body and mind. So although we do not intentionally create motion, there may still be non-volitional movements, such as the beating of the heart, the expansion and contraction of the lungs, images and emotions flitting through the mind. We are aware of such motions, but we do not pursue them. We do not chase them. We do not get involved in them. So letting one's field of attention be steady and still, sharp, clear, and still. Centered in the body, clearly aware of body and mind. Yet not moving at all. And as body and mind settle deeper and deeper into stillness, you may begin to notice a subtle pleasantness, like a soft, glowing light, warm, soothing light in the body-mind. If you do, notice this soft, gentle, warm pleasantness. Try to gently, slowly intensify that pleasant sensation all through body, mind. Letting it grow stronger, brighter, and more enjoyable with each moment.
Thank you, Bhante, for guiding us in that meditation. And welcome to some more friends joining in. So hello to Aum, Denise, Gurgle, Amaranta, Putrika, Priyanka, as well as UD. So good to see everyone. So tonight we'll hear some words of Dhamma from Bhante Suddhāso. And if you have questions at any time, feel free to type them in as they come to you, and we'll address them at the end of the talk. So at this time, I'll pass things over to Bhante Suddhāso for this evening's Dhamma talk.
So we'll start by paying homage to the Buddhas. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ Dhammaṃ Saṅghaṃ Namassāmi. Good evening, friends. So today we'll be speaking a little bit about the formless attainments, which are sometimes called the arupa jhanas, or the arupa samapati. So arupa literally means non-physical, and samapati means attainment. These are in a somewhat unusual category in that they are meditative attainments, so states of mind that you can attain through meditation practice, which the Buddha mentions in many suttas, but which do not seem to be necessary for attaining awakening. So it's an ongoing subject of debate as to why the Buddha mentioned these mind states at all. And I'll speak in a few minutes, I'll speak about some possibilities about why the Buddha spoke about these four states of mind. But first I'll give a bit of an overview of what the four arupa samapatis are, these four formless attainments, what they are, how one accesses them, and some of what the Buddha has to say about them in a number of different suttas. So first I'll give the standard description of how to enter the four formless attainments, and this standard description you find in countless suttas. So dozens upon dozens of times you'll come across this standard description. So the standard description, so in Pali, the first one is called akasananchayatana. So this is the domain of infinite space. And the description that the Buddha gives on how to enter, he says, Sabbaso rupasanyanang samitikama. So that means completely transcending the perception of physicality. Completely going beyond the perception of physical things. Patiga sanyanang attangama means the disappearance of perceptions of resistance. So this appears to be referring to the way that physical objects seem to resist each other. So if you press against a wall, then you can't just move through the wall resists you. So this is the experience of the physical world, is that when physical things come in contact, they resist each other. So in order to reach this first perception, this experience of infinite space, it's necessary to let go of the perception of all physicality and that includes the perception of the resistance that physical objects have to each other. And the third instruction that he gives is na natta sannyanang amanasikara, which means not paying attention to perceptions of variety. So disregarding the appearance of variety, disregarding the appearance of diversity, the appearance that there's many different things and different kinds of things. So another aspect of the physical world is that it seems to be composed of many different objects of various sorts. So different kinds of objects, different kinds of sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. Different things, different activities within the physical domain. So it's necessary to disregard that appearance of variety. And this is important because elsewhere in the suttas, the Buddha mentions, actually in a few places, he mentions that all of the four formless attainments are dependent upon the perception of unity. So all of them are characterized by a unity of perception. So one is not perceiving many different things, you're just perceiving one thing. And this first one here is the one thing that you're perceiving as infinite space. So this infinite space is empty. There's nothing in it. That's why we call it space. So it's the perception of infinite empty space. So this is the first of the four formless attainments. So just to recap, one accesses it through transcending perceptions of physicality and of physical resistance, and disregarding variety and diversity. So in this way, one can access this state of mind of where one seems to be experiencing only infinite empty space, extending limitlessly in all directions. Then the next instruction the Buddha gives for the next state of mind is Suddhaso akasa nancha yatanang samatikkamma. So this means completely transcending the domain of infinite space. Then one is able to access the experience of infinite consciousness, which is the second of the four formless attainments, the experience of infinite consciousness. So the experience of infinite consciousness arises from the experience of infinite space, in that one recognizes that one is having this experience of infinite space extending in all directions, so limitless, open, empty, infinite space. So in order for consciousness to be able to hold an object of infinite size, namely infinite space, in order for consciousness to be able to hold an object of infinite size, then consciousness must also be infinite. So one then disregards the perception of infinite space and instead turns one's attention to the consciousness which is holding that infinite space. And that consciousness itself is just as infinite as the space that it's holding. So this is another perception of unity, by the way, in that then one is paying attention just to infinite consciousness and not to anything else. So the perception of infinite space disappears and is replaced by the perception of infinite consciousness. Then the third state of mind that he mentions starts off similarly with saying that one completely transcends the domain of infinite consciousness. And one enters into the perception or experience or thought that there is nothing. So in Pali, this is natti kinchi, which means there is nothing whatsoever. So this, once again, it's a state of mind. So it's not an attainment of wisdom, but rather it's a particular way of relating to the world. It's a way of relating to the world as being completely devoid of all objects. So there being nothing at all. So not even consciousness at this point. There is simply awareness that there is nothing. Then the final of the four formless attainments, the Buddha says, by completely transcending the domain of nothingness, then one can enter the domain of neither perception nor non-perception. So this is a very refined state of mind. So coming from the previous one, so one is having this experience of there being nothing whatsoever, only the perception of nothingness. That's the only thing that remains. In the third formless attainment, there's only the perception of nothingness, the perception that nothing exists. So with the fourth attainment, one is discarding even the perception of nothingness. So there's no perception happening, and yet one is still awake. One is still aware. So this is why it's called neither perception nor non-perception. You can't be said to be perceiving anything at all. You can't be said to be percipient. And yet, you're not unconscious. So you can't be said to be impercipient. This is where we get into this paradoxical state of mind, where one is still awake, but the mind is in such a subtle and refined state that it is incapable of perceiving anything at all. It's not even capable of having the perception of nothingness. So these are the four formless attainments. In a number of suttas, the Buddha also mentions a fifth state of mind called sanya vedeta nirodha. So the cessation of perception and feeling. And this is a particular state of concentration which is only accessible to people who are either fully enlightened or who have attained the third stage of awakening, the stage of non-return. So this is not an attainment which is accessible to ordinary people. It's something which is only accessible to people who are very far along the stage of awakening. And the reason for this is because to enter the cessation of perception and feeling, one's mind has to be completely free of all desire and all aversion. So this is why it's only accessible to non-returners, arhants, and Buddhas. But that's not normally included in the list of the four formless attainments. So, and it's something which is accessible only to people who are already mostly or fully enlightened. So I won't say too much about the cessation of perception and feeling. I'd like to focus mainly on the previous four, the mundane formless attainments. Just reiterating again that to enter the perception of infinite space, one abandons the perception of physicality. Then for each of the subsequent attainments, one abandons the prior attainment. So to enter infinite consciousness, one discards the perception of infinite space and directs one's attention just to the consciousness which wraps that space. To enter the perception of nothingness, one discards the experience of infinite consciousness and notices that there are no objects whatsoever contained within that consciousness. So it's paying attention to the absence of things. So that's what the mind is focusing on, is the absence of things. It's focusing on nothing existing. Nothing seeming to exist anyway. The world continues doing whatever the world is doing while one is immersed in these states of concentration, by the way. So it's good to remember that although you may be having the experience that nothing exists, that doesn't actually mean that nothing exists. It just means that you're having a particular experience. Continuing with this, one discards the perception of nothingness and relinquishes all perception to enter the state of neither perception nor non-perception. So still awake, so you're not falling asleep here, but one is not paying attention to anything at all. So one is not having any particular experience. And it's worth noting, by the way, that in several suttas, the Buddha points out that during the first 3 formless attainments, there is still awareness. One is still fully aware of what one is happening. For example, in the Anupada Sutta, it mentions how Venerable Sariputta, while in the first 3 formless attainments, was clearly aware of all the constituent components of mind while he was in those states. But in the 4th formless attainment, the state of neither perception nor non-perception, the mind is not capable of analyzing itself. So one is not capable of perceiving the components of mind while in that 4th state. It's only after emerging from it that one is able to review back to what just happened. This is also important because in many suttas, the Buddha mentions that one can use the first 3 formless attainments as a basis for insight by recognizing their impermanence, recognizing that they share the 3 characteristics that all things share. One recognizes that, for example, the domain of infinite space is still impermanent, unsatisfying, and impersonal. It's still something which is conditional. It's a conditional phenomenon. It's a sankhara. It's still something which is subject to arising and ceasing, just like everything else. It's an experience which is produced by volition and ceases when volition changes. And the same with the perception of infinite consciousness and the perception of nothingness. While in those states, one can clearly see them as anicca, dukkha, anatta, impermanent, unsatisfying, and impersonal. And if one does so, then one can attain some stage of awakening based upon applying those wise perceptions to the experience of infinite space, infinite consciousness, or nothingness. But that in this 4th state of mind, the state of neither perception nor non-perception, it is impossible to practice insight meditation. It is impossible to apply the perception of impermanence when you have neither perception nor non-perception. The perception of impermanence would be too clunky. So it can't be done when the mind is in such a refined state. So the 4th formless attainment, as far as I can tell, is completely useless. Has no use whatsoever from a Buddhist perspective. The prior 3 can be used as a springboard for wisdom, but the 4th one cannot. The 4th one just seems to be like taking an extended nap, except you're not quite asleep. So, coming back to the question of why did the Buddha talk about these 4 states of mind? One reason why I believe this was spoken about is because these are states of concentration which can be entered without wisdom. And if one enters them, one is having this incredible, far-out, trippy experience. And one may believe that that is enlightenment. So this was the case with 2 of the Buddha's teachers before the Buddha attained awakening. So before the Buddha attained awakening, he went to the most eminent meditation teachers available at the time. And one of them was teaching to enter the perception of nothingness. And so the Buddha followed their instructions and entered the perception of nothingness, and then emerged from it and realized that was not enlightenment. It was just a temporary, trippy experience. But after emerging from it, he was still experiencing dukkha. He was still experiencing confusion and suffering. Therefore, he was not enlightened. But his teacher believed that to enter the perception of nothingness was enlightenment. And there were many others who were followers of that teacher who believed so as well. And similarly, the next of the Buddha's teachers, before he set out on his own, was teaching the attainment of neither perception nor non-perception. And again, the Buddha followed the instructions and reached the attainment of neither perception nor non-perception, then emerged from it and realized that he still had suffering, ignorance, confusion. He was not enlightened. He had just had another far out, unusual state of mind, but that he was still not enlightened. And that was when he realized that these practices of the formless attainments were not in and of themselves a path to enlightenment. And that was when the Buddha set off to do his own practices and to try to figure out the path to enlightenment on his own. That was when he realized that there was nobody around who could teach him how to become a Buddha. He would have to figure it out by himself. So again, one reason why the Buddha may have spoken about these states is so that there were clear descriptions of them and clear statements that they are not enlightenment. So nonetheless, throughout Buddhist history, there have been a number of cases of people meditating and having far out experiences similar to these 4 states of mind, or perhaps matching these 4 states of mind, one or another of these 4 states of mind, and believing that they've attained enlightenment. So in particular, the experience of nothingness for many people seems like a realization of nibbana. It seems like a realization of cessation, but it isn't. It's just tricking your mind into thinking that nothing exists for a short period of time. So it's not an attainment of wisdom. It's just altering the way you're perceiving the world for a period of time. So ultimately, that's what these 4 states of mind are, is that they're states of altered perception, altered mind states. Again, similar to what one might happen under the influence of certain chemicals. One can have altered mind states. But that's not enlightenment. It's just a temporary distortion of the perceptual process. Similarly, one can train the mind to have the perception of infinite space. Does that actually mean that reality is composed of infinite empty space? Not really. It just means that you're capable of training your mind to have that experience. If you train the mind to experience infinite consciousness, does that mean that the fabric of reality is composed of infinite consciousness? No, it just means that you can train your mind to have that kind of experience. That's all. So if one has the experience of infinite space or infinite consciousness or of nothingness, one is not having some deep, wise realization. This is not the arising of insight. It's simply training the mind to produce a particular altered state, an altered experience. So this is an inward experience. Somebody who's in any of these states of concentration, from the outside, other people would it just looks like somebody meditating. So everybody else knows that reality is not composed of infinite empty space. It's just the person meditating who's having that experience. So it's in an internal state of mind, an internal experience. It's not a realization of the true nature of reality. Nonetheless, it is an experience which can be used to cultivate insight if one goes into it with that intention. Just as the 4 ordinary jhanas, the 4 physical jhanas, which I'll talk about in a few weeks. I spoke a little bit about them this morning, and I'll speak about them again before too long. Those also can be used as springboards for developing insight, for developing wisdom, if one goes into it with that intention. If you just go into it with the intention of blissing out for a while, then that's all it will be. But if you go into it with the intention of cultivating the perception of impermanence, then that can happen. Similarly, with the first 3 of the 4 formless samadhis, if you go into it with the intention of developing insight, then that's possible. But if you just go into it seeking to have a far out, trippy experience, then that's all that will happen. You won't get any wisdom from it. So I pulled out a few other interesting suttas related to these subjects. I've actually already covered most of the material that I pulled out, but there's a few more that I wanted to emphasize. One is from the Chula Sunyata Sutta. So this is from the Majjhima Nikaya, the Lesser Discourse on Emptiness, which by itself is a really beautiful sutta that I highly recommend reading through in full. So one of these days I'll go through it during sutta study, but not today. Today I just want to emphasize a few particular points. So this sutta begins with it goes through a progressive series of meditative states. So beginning with one, going to the forest, going to the wilderness, and disregarding the perception of the village. So not paying attention to buildings and activities and so on. Then not paying attention to the perception of humans. So disregarding the experience of people, of other people. Then it goes on to disregarding even the perception of the wilderness. So not paying attention to the trees and the rocks and the animals. Then it goes on to not paying attention to the perception of the earth. So not paying attention to this physical mass of rock and stone that we're sitting on. And from that, then one can pay attention to the perception of infinite space. So this sutta is just giving a little more detail here in the beginning, a little more detail about what it means to not pay attention to anything physical. So the Buddha here is giving a progressive series. You're not paying attention to villages and towns and such. You're not paying attention to humans. You're not paying attention even to the wilderness, to the forest. And you're not even paying attention to the earth. So you're not paying attention to anything physical whatsoever. And then the mind can enter the unity of the perception of infinite consciousness. And he also says one then recognizes that whatever trouble or hassle or irritation there is that arises from paying attention to villages and people and so on, disappears. So when one is in the perception of infinite space, then all of the irritation and agitation that comes from paying attention to physical activity is totally gone. But there's still this slight irritation of the perception of infinite space. So that's not as irritating as paying attention to physical things, but it's still a little bit irritating. So then by not paying attention to infinite space either, then one can enter the unity of the perception of infinite consciousness. And that also is free of the irritation of the perception of infinite space, but it has a more subtle kind of irritation, which is the irritation caused by paying attention to infinite consciousness. And it's irritating just thinking about it. I find limited consciousness pretty annoying. So imagine infinite consciousness. That's just even more annoying. So then by not paying attention to infinite consciousness, one can enter the perception of nothingness. So that lacks the irritation of infinite consciousness, but it still has the subtle irritation of the experience of nothingness. Again, that sounds irritating just thinking about it. So I don't actually know why somebody would want to enter these states of mind. Again, they just sound a little bit irritating. So I find it lovely that the Buddha is actually pointing out that these states of mind are irritating. They're kind of annoying. And so by disregarding the perception of nothingness, one can enter the perception of neither perception or non-perception, the experience of neither perception or non-perception. But again, the Buddha says that even that is slightly irritating. So next, he gives a fifth step, which is not found in most of the suttas where the Buddha talks about the formless attainments. So then he says, by not paying attention to the experience of neither perception or non-perception, instead one pays attention to the unity based upon objectless concentration. So in Pali, that's animitta ceto samādhi. So objectless unification of mind, objectless concentration. So this is because all of the previous states of meditation he was mentioning were dependent upon focusing the mind on something. So focusing on the wilderness, that's focusing on something. Focusing on the earth, that's focusing on something. Focusing on infinite space, that's focusing on something. It's a nimitta, it's an object of attention that you're focusing on. Focusing on the experience of infinite consciousness, or the experience of nothingness, or even the experience of neither perception or non-perception. Each one of those is a thing, it's an object, it's a nimitta. It's something that you pay attention to. So you discard anything that you might pay attention to, whether it's physical or mental, whether it's a state of perception or neither perception or non-perception, any experience. You discard all of it. You don't focus on anything at all, any experience of body or mind. Don't focus on any of it, but maintain your alertness. So this is what's called animitta samadhi, which I talk about relatively often. So if you've been following this channel for a while, you've probably heard me talk about animitta samadhi before, objectless concentration. So objectless concentration, it lacks the irritation caused by any of the formless attainments, but it still has a subtle irritation involved. And that's because your body, mind are still operating under the influence of ignorance. So in the Chula Sunyata Sutta, the Buddha then says that next one must direct one's attention to the elimination of ignorance, the elimination of one's defilements. As because only then can one transcend even the subtle irritation that comes with animitta samadhi, the subtle irritation that comes with objectless concentration. So again, that's an interesting sutta in that it's giving animitta samadhi as a step beyond the formless attainments. So normally animitta samadhi is presented by itself as a standalone meditation technique which encompasses both samatha and vipassana, so both tranquility and insight. But here in the Chula Sunyata Sutta, objectless concentration is given as a next step after practicing with the four formless attainments. Another short reference to these that's worth pointing out is from the Salayatana Vibhanga Sutta, so from the Majjhima Nikaya, where it refers to the four formless attainments as being examples of equanimity based upon unity. So the characteristics, the two principal characteristics of all four formless attainments is one, equanimity. So the mind is extremely peaceful and impossible to disturb. So that's equanimity. And the other one is unity, as I mentioned earlier. So all four of them is based upon a single perception dominating one's entire mind. So that there are no separate objects appearing in the mind. There's only one object appearing in the mind, whether it's space, consciousness, nothingness, or the state of neither perception or non-perception. The mind has only a single object within awareness. Another interesting sutta that I pulled out here is from the Anguttara Nikaya, Book of the Tens. It's called the Samadhi Sutta. I'd actually spoken about this sutta a few weeks ago. So there's just the very end of it that I wanted to pull out. So in the sutta, Venerable Ananda had asked the Buddha, is there a state of perception where one is not perceiving earth or water or fire or air? So in other words, anything physical. So you're not perceiving anything physical. You're not perceiving infinite space, infinite consciousness, nothingness, or neither perception or non-perception. You're not perceiving this world. You're not perceiving any other world. And yet, nonetheless, you're still perceiving. So is there such a state of consciousness, such a state of mind, such a state of perception? So you're not perceiving seemingly anything at all, including the 4 formless attainments, and yet one is still perceiving. And the Buddha replies, there is. And the description he gives is, he says, so I'll read this first in Pali because this is one of my favorite phrases in the Pali canon. Etang santang etang panitang yaridang sabasankara samato sabbu paripati nissago tanha kayo virago nirodo nibbanang. So the Buddha says when a monk is in a state of samadhi which is focused upon this, then one is not percipient of anything physical or of any of the formless attainments or of this world or of any other world, and yet they are still percipient. So what is it they're percipient of? They're percipient of nibbana. So the statement that I read in Pali, what it says is, this is peaceful, this is sublime, that is, the tranquilizing of all formations or all activities, the relinquishment of all acquisition, all grasping, the elimination of craving, dispassion, cessation, nibbana. So by focusing one's mind on nibbana, cultivating the perception of nibbana, then one is percipient, but one is not percipient of anything whatsoever that we would normally identify as an object, so whether physical or mental. Let's see if there's anything else I wanted to bring out. Yeah, so I think that sums up everything I wanted to bring forward on the subject of these 4 formless attainments. Again, just emphasizing that they're not necessary for enlightenment, so you're actually completely welcome to disregard everything I've just said because it's not actually necessary. But it is of interest. And in particular, it's of interest because it's possible to have any of these 4 unusual states of mind and to misinterpret that as a sign that you've attained some stage of awakening. So you might, during meditation, have an experience where everything physical seems to disappear and there just seems to be infinite empty space in all directions. That's not enlightenment. However, if you perceive it as impermanent, unsatisfying, and impersonal, then that perception may lead you to enlightenment. And the same with these other formless states of mind. You might have these experiences, but they themselves are not any attainment of wisdom, unless you use them as a springboard for developing the perceptions of impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, not self, or emptiness. Then they can be of use. So I think I'll stop there for the evening. So if you have any questions or comments, I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you. Sadhu, 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 anumodami.
Thank you, Bhante, for sharing about the formless attainments. And hello to some of our friends joining in. Hello, Denise. Good to see you. Hello to Avis, Elaine, Geeta, Rick, Tora, as well as others. Christina, Ron, Original Mind. So again, if you have questions, feel free to type them in. There are a couple already. One from Geeta. It says, Bhante, when one attains the arupa jhanas, does one's sense faculties get subdued temporarily?
In the sense that you're not perceiving anything physical, then yes, because your sense faculties, the first 5 would be inoperable because they have nothing to perceive. Only the mind gate would still be operating. eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body would not be operating because one is not having any kind of physical experience. So only the mind gate would still be operating.
And Original Mind says, if the 8th jhana were free of consciousness, would it immediately lead to unbinding?
I assume by 8th jhana you mean the neva sanya, na sanya, so the perception, the experience of neither perception or non-perception. So I don't quite like calling that the 8th jhana because it's really not. There's 4 jhanas, then there are 4 formless attainments. And interestingly enough, in some suttas, the Buddha talks about the 4 formless attainments as things which you do after 4th jhana. But in other suttas, he talks about going directly into the formless attainments without going through jhana. So it doesn't appear to be strictly necessary to pass through the 4 jhanas before entering the formless attainments. Though I suspect it's much easier that way. I don't personally practice the formless attainments, so I can't talk from personal experience on these subjects. But it's quite clear in the suttas that you can't do anything productive in the experience of neither perception nor non-perception. So no, it cannot be used to attain awakening. So that is one samadhi state which is not useful. It's only after emerging from it that you can resume practicing Buddhism. Okay?
And Gita says, can one use the 3rd or 4th jhana to contemplate vipassana in order to gain entry to path and fruit?
So you're technically not asking about the 4 formless attainments, so that's technically off topic. But I'll answer anyway, even though I answer this question all the time. As far as I can tell, yes. There are many suttas which talk about cultivating liberating insight meditation while in 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th jhana, as well as in infinite space, infinite consciousness, and nothingness. So these 7 samadhi states can all be used to develop insight that leads to awakening. Okay?
And Jens asks, Bhante, can you provide the name of the first 2 suttas you referenced?
I don't remember the first 2 suttas I referenced.
I think in the grouping, like at the very end. The ones you pulled the excerpts from?
Send me an email and I'll just give you all the sutta references that I pulled out.
And Original Mind says, in reference to what they meant by consciousness, meaning name and form consciousness, like when Sariputta said, like, reads supporting one another. So if that's absent in the perception, the state of neither perception nor non-perception.
I suspect that consciousness is still present. It's just effectively completely dormant. So in the state of neither perception or non-perception, the mind is still awake. It's just been subdued to such an incredibly minute degree that one is not capable of being clearly aware of what's going on. One is not capable of doing anything whatsoever with the mind or even being aware of what's currently happening. And yet the mind is not asleep. So that seems to imply that consciousness is still operating. It's just operating on such an incredibly minimal level that it's not capable of being conscious of anything in particular. So once again, as I said earlier, the state of neither perception or non-perception cannot be used to attain enlightenment. This is clearly stated in countless suttas. Don't even try. Again, if you want to play with the formless attainments, that's fine. But remember that only the first 3 can be used to attain enlightenment. The 4th one cannot. You can spend your entire life in the 4th formless attainment, and you will never get 1 step closer to enlightenment. What will happen is you'll just be reborn as a mind-only deva. That's what will happen. And you'll hang out as a mind-only deva for a really, really long time. And then you'll be reborn as something with a physical body again. Doesn't really seem like much of a point to me. Just a little vacation. So I'm not personally interested in that. Okay.
And online anyway, that was the final question / comment. Not sure.
Ayasoma has some questions. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Bhante. So, can you speak a little bit about the correlation, if there is any, or the parallels between perception of infinite space and the perception of consciousness with the fifth and sixth elements contemplation?
So Ayasoma is asking about a correlation between the domain of infinite space and the domain of infinite consciousness with the fifth and sixth of the elements, which are respectively the space element and the consciousness element. Yeah, so my understanding is that one way of entering the experience of infinite space is to start by focusing on the space element, the akasa dhatu, so the space element. You focus on that to the exclusion of everything else, purely as a samadhi exercise. So not as an insight practice, but purely as a samadhi practice focused on the space element. And by doing that, you can enter the domain of infinite space. Similarly, the same with infinite consciousness. By focusing on the consciousness element purely as a samadhi practice, disregarding everything other than the consciousness element, then you can enter the experience of infinite consciousness. So that would be the relationship between them. So this is another example of a way where one could seem to skip ordinary jhana practice and access the formless attainments directly. If somebody wanted to do such a thing.
So then it sounds like the formless attainments are, at least as an entry point, always a samadhi practice. And then the first three can be shifted to insight practice. Is that correct?
Correct.
Great, thank you. And I have another question. I just don't quite understand how, I understand the shifting from nimitta to animitta samadhi, but I don't understand how one can then destroy the defilements in animitta samadhi, since it sounds like that would become the nimitta of the mind.
So Ayasoma is asking how one can destroy defilements while in animitta samadhi, since it would seem that defilements are objects, nimittas. So therefore one would have to be perceiving them as objects before destroying them. Is that correct? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
So my understanding is that animitta samadhi is actually not the least bit concerned with any specific defilement, but rather it's about constantly relinquishing and relinquishing and relinquishing until one starts shedding away layers of self-identity. So one is not focused on discarding the defilements in particular, but one is focused on shedding the self-identity, which is the root of all defilement. So the defilement I crave, I want, is based upon I. The defilement I hate is based upon I. The defilement I am confused is based upon I. So animitta samadhi, it starts with relinquishing all sensory objects. Then it moves to relinquishing all layers of mind. And finally to relinquishing layer after layer of self-identity until it's all let go of.
So would it be a part of the kind of weird like metaphor that I'm going to use. Kind of like going and entering a sauna and sort of like sweating naturally, like, and kind of perhaps like, I don't know, certain layers will start peeling off like naturally instead of doing something actively, if that makes sense. Like, instead of like turning the fire on, so to speak, like, or to kill the defilements. Could that be like an analogy in the way that you put the effort, of course, to enter in the sauna, but then as you're in the sauna, like it's more of a sort of passive system that, like passive, you put in place passive conditions rather than having to exert constant effort.
So Ayasoma is asking if animitta samadhi then is like entering a sauna where one is naturally sweating off one's defilements. So layers just peeling off naturally by themselves. So you don't have to like actively scrape off your skin. It just peels off by itself. It comes off on its own. And then she asked if animitta samadhi then is more of a passive practice. And I would say, first off, I like the metaphor. The metaphor is quite sweet. But I would say that animitta samadhi is neither passive nor active. There is an active element, which is that one must stay very alert. The biggest danger in animitta samadhi is the mind becoming blurry. Because then you'll just start wasting huge amounts of time. You'll think you're meditating when you're not. So the active component of animitta samadhi is keeping the mind very awake and alert. The passive element is letting all the defilement and delusion slough off on its own. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. And last question, unless there's another question on that.
Go ahead.
Okay, great. Can you elaborate a little bit between the difference, the difference between consciousness and awareness?
So Ayasoma asked an off-topic question, which we'll save for monk chat, which is the difference between consciousness and awareness.
No, because both are actually probably mentioned to you in this this talk, so it's very much on topic. Because you said, actually, I have the notes here. Like, for example, there is simply the awareness that there is nothing. So in the perception, there's the perception of space, the perception of consciousness, and then the perception of
nothingness.
Of nothingness, exactly. So there is no consciousness anymore, but there is awareness.
Yeah, it would seem that there's still awareness. There is awareness of there being nothing. Awareness that there's not even infinite consciousness.
But how is that? Is there like a particular Pali word?
So in this case, the Pali word is sanyi. So sanyi is perception or awareness or recognition, identification. So the recognition there is nothing.
Oh, okay. So then maybe I'm getting confused with the English. So then awareness is used as a synonym for perception.
In this occasion, I was doing that, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
That clarifies a lot. I was like just confused because, yeah, it didn't make much sense. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. Is that all your questions?
For now, anyway.
Okay, well, thank you for your questions. Those were great questions.
I have a question.
Yes, Bhante, please.
It is said Prince Siddhartha, when he was young, he had a teacher called Kaladevala or Asika. Asika, right? Sorry, Sarvamitra. Sarvamitra was his teacher when he was young, and he was the one teaching him archery and all that stuff. And not that one. The one before that, when Prince Siddhartha was very young. He came. He was King Suddhodana's teacher, and I think he was Asita or Kaladeva. That's his name. And then he came from heaven, it is said, and then he was touching the prince. The king wanted prince to salute his teacher, and then prince's feet was touching his forehead. And that time he was predicting that this prince is not a normal one. He is going to be a very powerful one. And if he stays at home, he would be a good one. And he was crying on the one hand, and then again he was laughing. And he was crying because he wouldn't be able to live that long. He was laughing because he was happy that this one is going to be a very good spiritual leader, a Buddha. So that time it is said because he was crying, he lost his jhana. And then, but eventually he wanted to practice again from the beginning, and then he would do that again. And as you said, he went to Neva Sanyana Sanyayatana, neither perception or non-perception. And therefore he could not actually listen to the Buddha's Dhamma. Just want to get your comment on that. And also why Buddha did not, even after his teachers, two other teachers, Asita, what are those two teachers? Uddakarama, Alara Kalama, Uddakarama. And they also attained those samapatis. And did they both attain Neva Sanyana Sanyayatana? Or if they were born in the Brahma realm? If that was the case, why he did not teach the Buddha? Teach them.
So Bhante Sumita asked first about the sage Asita, who saw the baby, the Buddha, shortly after the Buddha was born, and predicted that the Buddha would attain awakening. And it said that Asita practiced meditation and reached the neither perception or non-perception, and was reborn in that domain, so the heaven world of neither perception or non-perception, and therefore couldn't listen to the Buddha this time around. So I'm not actually familiar with the story of Asita going to the heaven of neither perception or non-perception. It might be from one of the commentaries, because I haven't read most of the commentaries. But yeah, my understanding is that, in the formless heavens, one is completely focused on one's own mind. So one is not capable of communicating with other beings. And therefore, one is not capable of listening to other beings. This is another reason why it's not really desirable to be reborn in the formless heavens, is because you can't listen to the Dhamma. You can't learn the Dhamma. And when you're in that state of mind, you also can't really practice the Dhamma. I don't know of any accounts of people practicing Dhamma or attaining awakening in the formless heavens. In the sensual heavens, yes, but not in the formless heavens. Similarly with the Buddha's former teachers, so Uddaka Ramaputta and Alara Kalama, as far as I can recall, both of them had attained the perception of nothingness. I think his second teacher had not actually personally attained neither perception or non-perception, because when the Buddha attained it, then the teacher said, "You've now surpassed me, you've gone beyond me." Anyway, so they would both have been reborn either in the heaven of nothingness or the heaven of neither perception or non-perception, but I don't know which one. But they also then would be unable to listen to the Buddha teaching. So shortly after the Buddha attained awakening, his first thought was, I should go back to those two teachers because they were actually getting pretty close. Like their meditation was really good. And if they just got the right instructions, they could attain awakening very quickly. But then he pointed his mind towards them and found out that both of them had already passed away and been reborn in the formless heavens, which meant it was impossible for the Buddha to communicate with them. So not even a Buddha who has incredible psychic power, not even a Buddha can talk to somebody who's in the formless heavens. It's somebody who's completely wrapped in their own mind. So they don't even perceive the existence of other beings, no matter how hard someone tries to communicate with them. So those are my thoughts on your two questions. Okay.
I think this topic is not taught by many teachers, so I think it's very daring endeavor, and also it's really very important for many people who are practicing jhanas and all. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. So Bhante Sumetta just pointed out that this topic is very rarely taught. So I'd like to point out that this topic was specifically requested by Ayasoma. If it had not been specifically requested, I would probably have never given a talk on this subject. So that's also a hint to all of you out there who are watching. If there's particular topics that you've been curious about, send in a request and it might happen. Okay, so I think that's it for this evening. So any final announcements?
Well, the final question, which is very short, was Roy wanted to clarify that sanya is cognition.
No, sanya is not cognition. You probably heard me say recognition. Sanya is related to memory, the process by which we identify things. Perceive things and identify things. So it's sometimes translated recognition, but it's not related to cognition. Cognition would fit probably under sankhara. Okay.
So that's the final question of the evening. Thanks everyone for joining us for tonight's guided meditation and Dhamma talk. And tomorrow morning we'll be back with Sutta study, so you can join us then. And we can end the evening with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
And enjoy the rest of your night.